But what we're going to dive into in a bit more detail after Nick and others have talked about the standards in use in healthcare. Let's take a step back. Let's talk about what is a standard, how are they used, how are they developed, and what's out there today on the market. So as noted, I'm Brendan Keeler. I'm a product owner for EHR Experience here at Redox. If you like health tech Twitter, I encourage you to follow me at the handle Brendan Redox. So when I kick off a presentation, just want to go through some goals. The first is the G.I. Joe principle. Knowing is half the battle. So I'm here to illuminate, enlighten, and teach, answer any questions you have, hopefully give you some new knowledge. The Maximus principle, I value not only teaching in a way that's not gives you knowledge, but also might be humorous or entertaining. And then the Dewey principle, I don't want to do anything that's inaccurate or erroneous, and definitely not anything that's offensive. So appreciate any feedback if I trend that way. I hope not. In terms of the stock photos of people being attentive, I can't see your faces, but my hope is that you're not asleep, that you're at least somewhere on the attentive, engaged stock photo, as you can see here. And perhaps you're so thrilled that you're screaming at your computer and giving positive hand gestures and not negative hand gestures. If you have feedback or thoughts or question, please put them in the chat. We'll try and get to them at the end. Be like this guy at the bottom, thumbs up. So who am I? My background is HL7 analyst. I worked for Epic for a number of years, domestically for a number of health systems. So I'm big into pipes, just like Mario. I'm a CDA evangelist, document exchange. Went over to the Netherlands and helped build up their document exchange, which is pretty robust in the US, but we're actually kind of leading in enterprise interoperability and document exchange. And now I'm an API enthusiast. I work for Redox. I just love JSON. And what does this all mean? If you don't know these acronyms, if you don't know what these terms are, we're going to dive right into it. So why are we having this webinar? As the famous XKCD comic goes, 14 standards. Someone's like, oh, let's get it all together and make a new one. There's 15 standards. The growth of standards since the 1970s in healthcare has just continued to amass. Someone on the last call said, why don't we converge HL7 and FHIR? And HL7 makes FHIR. HL7 version 4 is FHIR and is intended to converge, but the building up and replacing old infrastructure is really hard. So what we've seen is building up of standards over time, which some of the legislation that was just talked about is hopefully fixing and changing. Anyway, FBI warning, if you've seen this presentation before, you're about to get hot new content along the way. So bear with me. If you were listening to me 2 weeks ago, this is a HIMSS virtual session, so I had to put some new stuff in here for you. So what exactly is a standard? A standard is an agreed upon method for connecting systems together. A group of competitors of multiple parties who don't all work for necessarily one company or really have any relation except for their love of a particular type of data exchange, get together and say, let's build something by consensus. So ultimately, a standard is a product built on consensus. It's a collaborative product built by a community and an industry to serve a purpose. So that purpose may pertain to security. It may pertain to data transport. It may pertain to data format or structure, the meaning of codes. And to build that capability into your system is actually quite hard, or at least takes time and effort. To understand, to use a standard is akin to a person learning the language. So by learning Spanish, I might learn HL7 version 2. By learning Chinese, I might be learning FHIR. These different formats have grammar, they have vocabulary, just like our languages, except it's for computers. So imagine you're at a party, instead of everyone speaking different languages, they're speaking different standards, which is probably a really fun party. So what are some examples? Transport standards. These are things you may have heard of if you're technical outside of healthcare and you're coming into healthcare, or you may just have heard of in general. SFTP, Secure File Transfer Protocol. SMTP, which underpins our Gmail accounts and email. MLLP, which is specific to healthcare and most commonly used for HL7 version 2. All of these are standards that define how am I getting a data payload from point A to point B. So those are important, and there's a lot of them. And just deciding and negotiating between two parties the right transport protocols is important for data exchange. Secondly, when I'm sending data, how am I securing it? How am I preventing against bad actors or man-in-the-middle attacks? How am I ensuring that there's the right authentication and authorization? So going from sort of oldest to newest, you can see sort of VPNs as an old virtual private network wrapping around traffic between two parties, mutual TLS as big, heavy certificates with certificate authorities like DigiCert or others, and then sort of API, different methods of security for APIs that we're seeing more commonly, like basic OAuth or JWT, JSON Web Token. Content standards. So this is the real fun one. Ideally, or probably what a lot of you are focused on or hearing about or have questions about. HL7 version 2, the old bad boy out there and very prevalent in our industry. X12 used for payers, CCDA, CDA, CCD, which all really describe document exchange of clinical summary documents of an encounter or for a patient. NCPDP and DICOM specific to the pharmacy realm and the imaging realm, and then FHIR, the hottest standard on the market. Code and terminology standards define standardized way of describing the specific data elements. So if content standards define the grammar, when I'm talking about a certain topic, how do I talk about it in a way that the other system can understand? Codes are the specific words. How do I say what a glucose test is? How do I say what a glucose result is? What's the chargeable code for a given procedure? How do I describe a particular immunization or a particular diagnosis? These coding and terminology standards give a national or international vocabulary for exchange between systems. They're really important, but unfortunately, many enterprises right now, they built up their systems at a time before these terminology standards, or when they did, it was too prohibitively expensive for them to license them. So mapping between their local code sets and external national code sets is an important effort that many of them have done or are in progress with to ensure that when they send from point A to point B, it's understood. We're going to focus today a bit on content standards because they're the most fun. We could probably do follow-ups in regards to the other types of standards if there's interest. So what's not a standard? Anything that's proprietary, anything that's developed and offered by a vendor themselves, or perhaps by the government. Just because the government makes something doesn't necessarily make it a standard. It can, though, very easily, given their weight. Historically, this was a barrier to entry. HL7 came about as a backlash against vendor proprietary methods of connecting hospital systems. They said, oh, let's get together as an industry so that we can have HL7 version 2 to go between parties, because the documentation was bad. It was hundreds of thousands of dollars to connect. There were misaligned incentives where big EHR vendors at the time were using their proprietary standards and only deploying them, sending you the PDF for the documentation to connect when their customer really pulled their arm behind their back. We see now in the modern internet era a new approach that makes proprietary methods not so scary all the time. Apple, Android, they use a lot of industry standards for sure, but for their app programs, they're using their proprietary standards, data structures, etc. But they're well documented. They have open documentation. They have great support, or should have great support, and they might have broad marketing and distribution channels that are offered as part of taking part of this platform. Salesforce is another great example of a platform approach where the Salesforce APIs, data structure, etc., are exposed to developers to give a superlative development experience, and that's where proprietary methods in this new era can be actually quite positive in industries where they're sort of de facto standards. Allscripts and Athena are two examples of pioneers in this. They have proprietary APIs. They have API programs that they offer to, that aren't exactly standards across the industry or vendors, but have that open documentation and superlative support, and then possibly broad marketing and distribution channels to help you sell your products better. So who makes standards? Consensus-based standards committees or organizations, SDOs. HL7 is not the oldest, not even in healthcare, but the most successful, the dominant standards development organization. They make HL7 version 2, HL7 version 3, CCDA, and most recently FHIR. DICOM. DICOM is imaging exchange. So between imaging modalities like radiology modalities and the picture archiving system or the radiology information system. X12, this is for communication between hospitals, healthcare organizations, and payers, insurance primarily. It can also be used for purchase orders, and so perhaps if a hospital has, wants to order 500 Tylenol, they might send an X12 850. X12 is used more broadly than healthcare, but in terms of the payment, the interactions between healthcare organizations and payers, it's still defined and codified into law and used by more or less every hospital in some capacity for claims, for referrals, for eligibility. IHE came along 1990s, really took off in 2000s to define roles around standards. So when I have a hospital EHR and a lab system, what are the right transactions and different standards that should be used between those roles? They also have deviated from that mission a little bit and have created some of their own content standards, but primarily are focused on how do actors in healthcare standardly interact? What does a lab order look like? What does a lab result look like? Those sorts of things. ASTM is actually one of the older healthcare standards organizations. They built the first lab, the standards for lab data to lab information systems. HL7 has largely taken over their role, but occasionally they'll poke around. They came up with some of the early CCDA stuff, and then HL7 took it. NCPDP, this is interactions between pharmacies, pharmacy benefit managers, and hospitals. So prescriptions sent to pharmacies, pharmacies sending back, perhaps fill status updates with the newest version of the NCPDP standard, medication history from pharmacy benefit managers back to hospitals. All this is in NCPDP, which was formed as pharmacy benefit managers and pharmacies sort of grouped together and said, let's make our own standard. And then there are standards bodies for standards. So the American National Standards Institute is a standards body that certifies that other standards bodies are making standards up to a certain quality. So yeah, standards on standards, standardception. ISO is the international version. So many of the standards we're talking about here, many of the standards bodies like X12 are actually US specific. So if you go to the Netherlands, if you go to the UK, you may find they're using an international or European code set, like GS1 would be the equivalent for X12, which is used everywhere but the US because we like to make our own things here. So what makes a standard successful? What do you mean? Standards are, consensus-based, Brendan. Aren't they all successful? That is wrong. There are the history and landscape of healthcare IT is littered with dead or underused standards. Just like a product, just like any product, success of the standard comes from adoption. If it's well used, it builds, if I build that capability, then someone who wants to connect to me will maybe build that capability. Then someone who wants to connect to them will build that capability, and it takes off. That's not a given. There's just very many aspects of HL7 version 2, all of more or less of HL7 version 3, a lot of the IHE standards that are underutilized outside of, connectathons and things like that. And that adoption comes from two really paths. One's consumer demand. Does it meet the needs of the user base? Is it doing something valuable? Is it well documented? Is it easy to use? Is it something I can jump on and start using it with little to no knowledge, except for my use case? Are there software development kits and testing tools? And then what kind of cost is associated with using the standard? Some are, there's a trend towards fully open standards. Fire pioneered that, HL7 in 2012 moved to open standards, but still some like X12 or NCPDP may have costs associated with it. Government required standards or de jure standards. A government may come up with a standard and say, this is what we're using. They may also take something that's out there and say, this is the standard for the United States, or this is the standard for the Netherlands. So that's one other path that, it sort of uniformly says fire R4 is going to be used for patient auth. And that mandate, which came yesterday, now means that there will be a high rate of industry adoption, which is good. Uniform expectations and deployment make a standard successful, make it usable for developers. De facto standards can also arise. So if a standard, Google does this a lot, where they'll use something, they're so widespread, it becomes just used by everyone industry-wide, not necessarily in healthcare, but in other industries. So why do people get involved in standards? If you're thinking in a sort of benevolent fashion, they want to build a common good. They want to build the interstates, the infrastructure that others can build on, that they want to help everyone. And Graham Grave, who pioneered FHIR, often points to the idea of building a common treasure, building a common good as a reason for people to participate in standards development organizations. And that's certainly one of the reasons that Redox goes and gives our real world input to the HL7 working group meetings. To build a better user experience, building standard expectations for about what can be seen in the wild, seen and adopted by vendors in healthcare IT, builds a better developer experience, who build better tools. And just like this woman is using a cell phone that uses dozens and hundreds of standards that are invisible to her, it makes for a uniform experience. Everyone knows the pain of a non-standard charger. If you're an Apple user and you have to use that Lightning and everyone else has a USB, that's a pain. But standards and utilization and adoption of those standards fix that to some degree. In the less benevolent views of why people do this, it evens the playing field. It can help commoditize integration if there are well-deployed standards, input outputs that can be used. And that can be a competitive differentiator. If you develop to the standard and jump ahead, you can be ahead of your competition. You can have integration when others do not have integration. If you jump at the wrong moment, though, you could be offsides. You could be, maybe that standard never takes off. So you have to be sure or help push that a given standard that you want to be used industry-wide. Not only are you first, but you're the first of many. Standards historically documented in PDFs and Word documents now have moved to open online documentation. This is a great, for a developer experience, this is great for spreading and increasing participation and adoption. And that's what every goal of every standard should be, is widespread adoption. Trust paradigms. This is the ways that hospitals and different parties can interact. And there's more information I'll send later about what the trust paradigms constitute, but the oldest is edge interfacing. You sell your product, a lab system, to a hospital. Within that enterprise, you're making something for providers, you're making something for nurses, for radiologists, whatever it may be. Once you've sold or made that agreement, you sign a business associate agreement, and you connect in an edge interfacing fashion within the hub of that enterprise, that healthcare organization. Next up is enterprise interoperability between groups of enterprises. You sign one agreement, the Care Quality Trust Framework, the Commonwealth MSA, regional HIEs, direct trust, whatever it might be, and gain access to communicate in some fashion with large groups of hospitals, typically for transition of care in some fashion, or what these are designed around. And most recent and one of the more important topics of the last decade is patient authorization. I, as a consumer, I, as a patient, can use my credentials to authorize the exchange of data between myself and any institution I've been seen at. And the new regulations that came out yesterday reinforce this, really push this and advance this in a big way. Historically, these applications would have to sell to hospitals to get direct relationships one by one. That doesn't scale well unless there's a value prop for those hospitals, unless there's a value prop for the users. They're creating something for providers in addition to the patients, which wasn't always the case. Now, that can be, edge interfacing can be used to supplement patient authorization where the US CDI and other things haven't met the workflow needs, but this is a big step towards open access and decision-making by patients as consumers. The standards can be broken into 3 content categories. So EDI delimited, XML extensible markup language, and JSON JavaScript notation. I'm going to fly through these because we're running low on time. EDI delimited is the oldest, X12, HL7 v2 ER7 is the pipe delimited format of HL7 version 2, meaning that between each data element, you'll see a pipe. For the delimiter for X12 is an asterisk, and the delimiter for GS1 ENCOM, that international alternative to X12, is a plus symbol. A bigger picture of HL7 version 2, you can see the delimiters, you can see sub-delimiters between components, such as the asterisk. It's not really human readable, but it is compact and tight in terms of the information that's being conveyed. So if you have a schema, if you're familiar with HL7 version 2, you can read this and say, okay, the patient is William Jones, the next of kin is Barbara Jones and Michael Jones. You can read it, but you need to understand what each data element is in advance. XML fixed that in a large way. So XML, with the rise of the internet, said let's create computer computable formats that are also human readable. So if you read through an X12, or sorry, an XML, you can see that you can sort of look through and say, okay, I see here that the telephone number is blah blah blah. I see that the contact name is John Doe. It's a little bit more readable. It's a little verbose though. Every tag has an opening and a closing. So here's an NCPDP, new RX XML. Again, pretty readable and understandable if you take a look at the body. People said, okay, this is the WSDLs and schemas and all this for XML. It's just so heavy. What else can we do to convey data? And JavaScript came along, and it was popularized as a programming language in various ways. And along with that came the data format, JSON, which is derived from JavaScript. And you can see it's a little bit more lightweight, but also human readable. And this is a FHIR message in JSON format, the patient resource. So net new content. Let's talk about adoption, because I mentioned before that's important. What have we seen in the wild? So to give you a picture, if you're not familiar, what is Redox connected with? A lot of Epic. Epic is is one of the dominant vendors in the US, so 26% Epic. Athena, Cerner, Allscripts, etc. Make up some of the other top ones we've connected to. We've connected to, I think, 55 EHRs at this point in other systems. Across all of those, we see a lot of JSON, and that comes from certain vendors in particular, and then a lot of HL7 version 2. And again, that source, when they're sending to us, oftentimes JSON or HL7 version 2. Destination sort of flips, and I apologize for the colors. It might be a little confusing, but this chart oriented towards the largest being green for everything. So a lot of HL7 version 2, some JSON. If you look at capabilities across EHRs, the biggest EHRs, the Epics, the Athenas, the Cerners, have the most interfaces. They have the most inputs, outputs across all standards. They've invested more time into building out those capabilities. So the long tail of EHR is much more restricted in their interfacing and integration capabilities, unfortunately. So the things that you can do with an Epic or a Cerner or an Athena, you can't do with the Meditabs or the Carios or something. They just have a more limited set of integration capabilities. So adoption, if we're talking about Epic, heavy HL7 version 2 support. You can see 75 plus in and out HL7 version 2. It's because they built up so much. If you go to open.epic.com, They list out all of their interfaces. There's a ton of different possibilities of what they can send via HL7 version 2. Worth noting, open.epic.com is a great resource. Not all EHRs have open listings of their input outputs across various standards. So Epic and a few others do. Worth checking that out. Edge interfacing part 2, uscdi.epic.com. As part of those new regs, this will be a path to pull the uscdi data set via FHIR. And then App Orchard is a app program, sort of that platform type approach where you might pay some money up front or to join. You might go through a registration and have access to a broader set of FHIR and proprietary APIs. Enterprise interoperability, CCDA, including some custom document types. They're on Care Quality. They helped found it. They're a big proponent of it. All Epic sites are live on Care Quality to exchange those CCDAs. They also do NCDP, X12, and then their patient auth support is listed at open.epic.com. Cerner, really heavy HL7 version 2, one of the bigger users of that. They're quickly moving towards what's called Code, which is their sort of app program. It's got right now has the USCDI and then extra FHIR resources. They send CCDA through Commonwealth, which is connected to Care Quality. They do NCPDP, X12. Their patient auth is done through Code. Right now, DSTU2, but they just released some FHIR R4 support, which is the standard that's going to be used in this next, as a result of this next legislation. So they're, I think, pretty far ahead in terms of deploying patient auth via R4. Their app program is a bit newer, so it doesn't have as much adoption, but excited with their FHIR first approach there. Note that right now their patient auth is site-by-site enablement, so they are not like Epic where they just list endpoints and anyone can patient auth their way in. You have to go and get permission for your app at the hospital right now, and that should go away or be changed in the coming years as a result of the legislation. MDP, lost the P. More disruption, please. Athena was very early on saying, we're going to be a platform. We're going to be this developer-centric approach. They have a ton of APIs in their own proprietary format available via MDP. They also have other support for HL7 version 2. They have sort of like Epic, they have a nice listing of everything they support online on their website. They're part of Care Quality and Commonwealth. And then their MU3 docs list out their DSTU, FHIR DSTU, patient auth support. Again, one of those ones that you have to enable, I believe, site by site with the hospitals currently. Lastly, the last one I'll talk about today, all scripts. And going back, you'll see a lot more JSON here, less HL7 version 2, again, as a symptom of their history as a disruptor and with a developer-centric API program approach. Allscripts has HL7 version 2 support, but is very quickly, you can see almost 50-50 moving towards a developer program, a robust developer program, offering both a FHIR path and then Unity APIs, their proprietary format. They do CCDA through Commonwealth. They do e-prescriptions and such through NCPDP. And then they also have an MU3 site. Essentially, any certified EHR is required to have an MU3 API site. So you can check that out through the certified EHR link at the end of this presentation. Cruising through this, just talking about what's there now. So you see a lot of HL7 version 2, some vendor APIs, soon FHIR for provider use cases in some capacities. FHIR perhaps for enterprise interoperability, in particular Care Quality is poking around with that. And then patient authorization. With MU3, it wasn't required to use FHIR, so there's a mix of patient authorized apps being able to access through FHIR or through vendor APIs. Now it's going to be all FHIR R4. I'd love to see FHIR as much as possible, and ideally, single standard. You saw there a lot of different variations of the standard in play. X12 is old and gross. Would love to replace or overhaul that. Same with DICOM and NCPDP. Having broad internet enabled, JSON enabled ideally would be best. Anyway, other resources available here, certified EHRs, a couple different pieces that have been written on these topics. Our resource library, check us out at these sites. Thank you so much.